When you're alone, who comes around?
Polyphony is something that means more than one thing. Like a song with more than one melody.
Come on, kid, we need a tenor.
But it's also the name for a very particular style of vocal harmony. If I had to choose one kind of music for my lonely island, this would be it. Still, sometimes I have to admit, even to myself, that polyphony is often pretty boring. I mean, nothing is happening most of the time. No great solos, no acrobatics, no tasty chords. Just this dusty church choir. Minus the badass organ. So maybe this is all just background music. You know, songs to light some good incense to with your buddies and relax. Maybe take a bath. Anyway, this still doesn't explain the kind of attention this style got when it was brand new. People writing thick books on how it works, spending fortunes on polyphony and venerating its composers. Like architects or artists. But if this really is an acquired taste, how do we get there?
Das musst du hören, Martha. Immer und immer wieder. Bis du verstehst, was du hörst.
Now, there's always a risk involved with learning to appreciate something by studying its theory, because it's easy to mix up actual appreciation for the thing itself with the simple gratification of recognizing something from your textbook. It's like a tour guide telling you how Florence Cathedral was consecrated in 1436 to music by Guillaume Dufay. So you can finally cross that building off your bucket list and go for a coffee.
Aspetti e vedrà. Vediamo. Ecco fatto.
In a way, architecture is similar to polyphony like that. I mean, what should we even be paying attention to? Is it the front, the inside, how it's decorated, how difficult it was to build, how it looks from a distance, or what it's like to walk around in? The Venetian architect Daniele Barbaro would visualize buildings pretty much the way it's still done today. What's special is his way of talking about them. He writes that the column spacings of different types of temple affect our eyes similar to how the spaces in between the notes affect our ears, and how that which sounds consonant to the ears will also look beautiful to the eyes. Okay, time to step out, have another coffee.
C'è una soluzione. Esatto.
Barbaro's book on architecture is typical for the Renaissance in how it goes straight from the superficial to the hyper-profound, where anything can be a puzzle piece in explaining, well, everything. And
being in tune with every molecule in the universe requires a great deal of concentration.
So, what at first may seem like a book about how to build a house actually uses every chance it gets to build an entire school of thought, where all the arts and sciences share a common ground, speak in the same terms. To Barbaro, it seemed only natural to have architects learn from musicians and vice versa. And it's the authority on music at the time, Josefo Zarlino, who eventually picks up and elaborates upon one of his ideas. Let's say a note were to music, what a point is to geometry, a number to arithmetic, or a moment to time. So if you sound the pitch and repeat it after a while, it describes a straight line. Adding higher or lower pitches has them relating to that first reference pitch. Zarlino also calls it horizon. So when each of these relations is drawn as a line, they together describe a flat surface. But what allows us to hear actual harmonies is that our ears not only relate each note to the horizon, but also to each other. Each pitch is its own reference point with its own dissonances and consonances. And suddenly, all the points, lines and surfaces form a solid in 3D space. This new way of thinking about music is really sort of like stargazing and realizing how all the constellations aren't just flat pictures on the night sky, but form shapes in space. That's how Galileo Galilei first described the Milky Way some years later as nothing else than a cluster of countless stars. a discovery from the same school of thought someone like Zarlino belonged to. In fact, Galileo's father, the lute player Vincenzo Galilei, was one of his students. Now, of course, Zarlino's model wouldn't work as a way of visually explaining a song, but the key takeaway here is that polyphonic music has some kind of geometry, that it takes place on points, lines and surfaces with spaces in between, sort of like architecture.
It's hard to believe my body and I were ever attached. We are so totally incompatible. I mean, he is still dangling from the food chain, and I am in the stars. Oh, it is so unmetaphysical. No, go away.
Still, nothing about Zarlino's model is actually exclusive to the music of his time. Renaissance polyphony, but also pretty much everything we are listening to, has harmonies.
Sans doute les notes que nous entendons alors tendent déjà selon leur hauteur, leur quantité, à couvrir devant nos yeux des surfaces des dimensions variées, à tracer des arabesques, à nous donner des sensations de largeur, de ténuité, de stabilité, de caprice.
The kind of music that Marcel Proust is describing had at this point become pretty much unrecognizable from anything Zarlino had theorized about 3 centuries earlier. Despite all the intellectual sophistication behind it, Renaissance polyphony is really only using a tiny fraction of the harmonies, rhythms and shapes we find later. And that actually is why it may seem so boring. The keystone to understanding the point of these limitations happens to sit right where Zarlino got the idea for his diagram. It's this one statement that Daniele Barbaro's entire school of thought rests on. In nature, the small differences are not subject to human sense. What this means is that we can only understand what we can simplify. Only when a thing is rationed into clear terms can our mind really make sense of it. From an artist's point of view, this rational way of thinking divides the canvas into squares and places the figures not on the canvas itself, like in a medieval painting, but on a geometrical grid. This literally puts them in perspective, but also lets you intuitively make sense of spaces not even visible on canvas. In music, a similar effect also needs things to be made as square as possible. This means clear rhythms and simple harmonies. Simple as in sticking to what this guy had once figured out to be the simplest ratios between pitches, the consonances. So in polyphony, there is a strong focus on discerning them from the busier sounding dissonances. You can't just go or, and definitely not
like I'm substituting the 9 for the third and the third for the sharp 11.
Instead, all we have is really just root chords and not much else. When you abandon the simplicity and make use of all the more involved harmonies and rhythms, it opens up a whole range of effects to draw the listener in, direct their attention like a busy shot in a movie, the camera always moving with the protagonist. With a static viewpoint, even an intense scene will by comparison seem uneventful, if not awkward, to someone used to having their attention directed for them. But what this allows the listener to do is choosing what to focus on at any given moment, like any particular line, surface or space. As in a video game, there is an interactive element to this. So what the apparent simplicity and rational construction of polyphony really does is enable the listener to somehow enter the music and move around in it freely, exactly because it's built in this clear-cut, somewhat predictable way. There's the sense of an imaginary space. And we still like to picture the inner workings of a rational mind as a kind of classical architecture, a machine for human thought to walk around in, like the imaginary cities painters began to render just as perspective and vanishing point had been discovered. By the time Zarlino summarized what he knew about polyphony, or what he called the art of counterpoint, it had long become the default for music, just like point perspective for painting. And as cold and artificial as these early experiments may seem, they also express the painter's excitement for their newfound roles as virtual architects. Even someone like Leonardo da Vinci used grid lines to make sure his compositions fell into perspective just right. But it's exactly here where he would change his mind and turn his own construction into ruins. It seems like after only a few years, people had already lost most of their excitement for painting these immaculate, ideal pieces of architecture. Some artists choosing to pre-destroy their own architectural compositions before realizing them on the actual canvas. Of course, there's all sorts of possible reasons for this, whether the ruins are simply part of the story or carry a symbolical message. Sometimes you also get a hint of that romanticist nostalgia that we know today. Still, I don't think these artists would have indulged so much in this whole process of first coming up with a perfectly good design and then figuring out how best to tear it down if it weren't for a good, functional reason. Putting an intact building on a canvas has the downside that you can't really show much of it. Any wall that still stands also hides most of the architecture that's behind it. So to offer a good view on all the lines and surfaces, spaces and points, you've got to
tear down this wall.
Even architects like Daniele Barbaro would pick up on this whole ruin aesthetic, going out of their way to make the examples in their otherwise dead serious textbooks look old and overgrown, like the ancient sites they would study. But this also ends up lending them something tangible, as if you could just step inside and pick up any stone you like. A sense of interactivity that's still inspiring today's level designers to pre-destroy their virtual environments. Because from a player's perspective, there's way more interactive potential in a ruin than a perfectly good real-life building, like the ones Daniele Barbaro teaches how to make in his book. And just as architects cannot leave any structural flaws or missing parts in their designs, Josefo Sarlino's art of counterpoint also wouldn't allow for inconsistencies, broken rules, or mistakes in the polyphonic structure. In that way, Renaissance music in its written form often really happens to be as flawless and pure as the buildings in architectural diagrams. But who actually wants to live in a diagram? And if an artist's way of realizing architecture is to ruin it first, isn't polyphony also somehow made to be ruined?
Thank you.